We're now going to begin the nervous system. The nervous system actually is the most complex of all the systems of the body, but we're going to do our best to keep this as simple as possible. First, how is the nervous system organized? The nervous system is divided into two divisions. The first is called the central nervous system, or CNS, and the other is called the peripheral nervous system, or PNS. Now, the central nervous system, the CNS, everybody gets. That's real easy to understand. That's simply your brain and your spinal cord. The brain and spinal cord are, of course, the most protected organs of the entire body. The brain is entirely surrounded and protected by the skull, and the spinal cord is enclosed within the vertebral column. So these are very important organs of the body. They are the most protected organs in the body, and there are many layers of protection, as we'll see. We did remind you that the spinal cord begins at the base of the skull, where there's a hole or an opening called the foramen magnum. And in an adult, the spinal cord extends from the foramen magnum down to about the level of the second lumbar vertebra, around L2. That becomes important to know, we wrote that right here, because we're going to speak later about spinal taps or lumbar punctures, where a needle is inserted between the vertebrae to withdraw a sample of cerebrospinal fluid, and that needle would be inserted below at a lower level than where the spinal cord is, so it would be inserted below L2, second lumbar vertebra. Okay, now that's the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is always what bothers students a little bit. It's not that difficult. The PNS, the peripheral nervous system, consists of all the nerves branching off the brain and spinal cord. In our Mr. Skeleton Man right here, we can see these nerves coming off the spinal cord, coming off from the vertebral column. Here we have another model, and we can see these spinal nerves coming off through openings between the vertebrae called intervertebral foramina. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves that branch off the spinal cord. In addition, there are 12 pairs of so-called cranial nerves that branch off the brain. So these nerves coming off the brain, coming off the spinal cord, traveling out to the periphery of the body, traveling out to throughout the entire body, comprise the peripheral nervous system. Let's just look at a picture to see this a little bit better. We wrote, see page S17. Here on page S17, we can see bracketed here, it's a central nervous system made up of the brain and spinal cord. On the left-hand side of the diagram, written sideways, it says peripheral nervous system. It's cut off a little bit, peripheral nervous system. It is bracketed, and it includes the 12 pairs of cranial nerves coming off the brain and 31 pairs of spinal nerves coming off the spinal cord. Now, we do want you to know how this 31 pairs of spinal nerves breaks down as far as coming off the spinal cord through the vertebral column. There are 8 pairs of cervical spinal nerves, 12 pairs of thoracic spinal nerves, 5 pairs of lumbar spinal nerves, 5 pairs of sacral spinal nerves, and 1 pair of coccygeal spinal nerves. And yes, you need to know those numbers. Let's go through those numbers again, though. We're going to start with thoracic. There are 12 pairs of thoracic spinal nerves. That's easy to remember. After all, how many thoracic vertebrae are there? Well, you better remember there are 12 thoracic vertebrae. Remember, attached to each of the 12 thoracic vertebrae is a pair of ribs. So since you have 12 thoracic vertebrae, you have 12 pairs of ribs, and you have 12 pairs of thoracic spinal nerves coming off from the chest level of the vertebral column. There are 5 pairs of lumbar spinal nerves. That's easy to remember because there were 5 lumbar vertebrae in the lower back, and therefore correspondingly 5 pairs of lumbar spinal nerves. There are 5 pairs of sacral spinal nerves, and while we have only one sacrum, the sacrum at the down at the back of the pelvis is actually, during embryologic development, it actually is formed by the fusion of 5 sacral vertebrae that fuse to form one large sacrum. All right, so then it kind of makes sense that if there were 5 sacral vertebrae that fused together, we still have 5 pairs of sacrospinal nerves. We have 1 pair of coccygeal spinal nerves, and while it's true that the coccyx or tailbone also embryologically fused from 4 coccygeal vertebrae that fused together, all right, fine, we have 1 tailbone, 1 coccygeal bone, and 1 pair of coccygeal spinal nerves. The one number that stands out that it doesn't seem to fit is the 8 pairs of cervical spinal nerves. After all, we have 7 cervical vertebrae in our neck. So how do we get 8 pairs of cervical spinal nerves? The answer is the first pair of cervical spinal nerves comes off between the skull and the atlas, between the skull and the very top first cervical vertebrae or atlas. And then there's a pair of cervical spinal nerves that comes out between each of the 7 cervical vertebrae. So if we've got a pair coming out between each of the 7 cervical vertebrae, but the very first pair came off just above the first cervical vertebra, that's a total of 8 pairs of cervical spinal nerves. Let's look at another picture on the next page, S18. On S18, we can see a view from the back side, the posterior side, showing the pair of C1, C2, C3. Here's the pair of C8, and the 12 pairs of thoracic and the lumbar spinal nerves. Notice that the spinal cord ends at about L2, L1 or L2 at the vertebral level. But nevertheless, these spinal nerves are branching off the spinal cord. They travel down and exit out of the vertebral column all the way down at the very bottom of the vertebral column. So we have all these lumbar and sacral and coccygeal spinal nerves still branching off, coming off the vertebral column. Now, these spinal nerves travel out, we said, to different parts of the body. And the word that we use for a nerve supply to a particular part of the body is the word innervation. You can see the root nerve in there, nerve. So the innervation simply refers to the nerve supply to a particular part of the body. Now this map, this picture, shows which spinal nerves innervate or supply which parts of the body. So just as an example of this, you'll notice that right here where it's showing this guy's forearm and his right thumb and index finger, it's labeled C6. I'm not going to test you on that, but that simply means that if that's his right hand, that the right 6th cervical spinal nerve supplies or innervates that part of the body. Of course, his left hand, his left thumb, would be innervated or supplied by the left C6. You have a right and left of each of these nerves. Now, that would mean that if a patient, and if you're a future nurse, nurse practitioner, physician's assistant, occupational therapist, physical therapist, so if a patient said that they either could not move their right thumb or they could not feel sensation from their right thumb, and they had been in an injury, that an accident, perhaps there has been damage to the right C6, the right 6th cervical spinal nerve. And that might be the cause of the inability to move that part of the muscle, activate the muscles of that part of the body, or feel sensation from that part of the body. Just to give a second example of the same thing, if we were to look right here at his foot, the big toe is innervated by L5, the 5th lumbar spinal nerve. If the patient were unable to move their right big toe or did not have any sensation from that right big toe and they had been in an accident, perhaps there had been injury to the 5th lumbar, the right 5th lumbar spinal nerve. So that's how this neuroinnervation works. We're going to keep this real simple. What I am going to ask you to know is that the cervical spinal nerves, the 8 pairs of cervical spinal nerves, innervate, they supply the neck and they supply the arms and hands. That much you should know. The 12 pairs of thoracic spinal nerves primarily innervate the torso. The chest and abdomen, the torso of the body, are innervated by the 12 pairs of thoracic spinal nerves. And the lumbar and sacrospinal nerves innervate the legs and feet. That much I would expect you to know for test purposes as far as neural innervation. Back on page S1, we wrote that each nerve is like a cable. I like to think of each nerve like a telephone cable. And just like a telephone cable would have hundreds of thousands, millions of wires inside of it, inside each nerve are hundreds of thousands, millions of microscopically thin nerve cells or nerve fibers. These nerve cells or nerve fibers or neurons, and all three of those words mean the same thing, are running inside each nerve. So in other words, let's draw a parallel. We know that a muscle, such as the biceps brachii, is actually made up of hundreds of thousands or millions of individual skeletal muscle cells or fibers. Similarly, inside each nerve, and these nerves are large. We can see these nerves coming off the spinal cord, right? And some of these nerves are quite large. And inside each nerve are hundreds of thousands or millions of microscopically thin nerve cells or nerve fibers. Now, some of those nerve cells in each nerve are sensory or afferent nerve fibers, and some are motor or efferent nerve fibers. What's the difference between sensory and motor? Sensory nerve fibers, sensory nerve cells, send information from your body to your spinal cord and brain, to your central nervous system. In a sense, we could call that the input signal. This is the input. This is the input signal, the information coming into our central nervous system. In contrast, the motor or efferent nerve fibers send signals, commands from our central nervous system, our brain and spinal cord, out to the organs of the body, activating them. Controlling, activating the skeletal muscles, activating the digestive tract, activating the heart, and controlling these so-called effector organs of the body. So they send commands. Yeah, I do want you to know that afferent is a synonym, another word that is used for sensory, and efferent is another word used for motor. You'd say, how am I going to remember that? Well, one possibility is that first you have the input signal coming in, and then you have the output signal going out. A comes before E. So the sensory input or afferent signal coming in, followed by a motor or output or efferent signal going out. Input and output. Information coming in, commands going out. A comes before E. We're now looking at page S3, and we now want to describe the microscopic structure of the nervous system, meaning the nerve cells. The actual nerve cells or neurons or nerve fibers. All three of these words, nerve cell, neuron, and nerve fiber, all mean the same thing. Remember that the reason why nerve cells or neurons are commonly referred to as nerve fibers is because nerve cells generally tend to be long and thin, like fibers. So they're referred to as nerve fibers based on their shape. The other type of cell in our body that is also long and thin and commonly called a fiber are skeletal muscle cells. They are referred to as skeletal muscle fibers. The other cells in our body largely are circular, they're spherical, they're cuboidal, they're columnar, but they're not long and skinny. Now, the characteristics of nerve cells, neurons, nerve fibers, is they exhibit excitability. We've learned previously that excitable cells are cells that have the capacity to generate an electrical current called an action potential. Remember, there are two types of cells in our body that exhibit excitability, that can generate these electrical currents called action potentials. Those are nerve cells and all muscle cells. Skeletal muscle cells, visceral smooth muscle cells, and cardiac or heart muscle cells. Those are the excitable cells of the body. Both nerve and muscle cells are regarded as the most highly specialized cells in the body. First of all, their shape, being long and skinny, makes them very delicate and makes it almost impossible for them to undergo mitosis or cell division. When we imagine a cell dividing, so we typically think of a spherical or round cell, and it constricts in the middle and divides into two smaller cells. But it's hard to imagine a nerve cell, or for that matter, a skeletal muscle cell, and in the case of nerve cells, they may be 3 feet, 4 feet, or longer in length. Imagine a cell 3 or 4 feet in length, thinner than a nylon thread, trying to divide into two. So it's essentially, these cells lose their capacity to undergo mitosis or cell division. We have learned the principle that the more specialized a cell, the less frequently it undergoes cell division or mitosis, and that's why when there is injury to nerve cells, they cannot undergo mitosis, they cannot replace those cells that are injured and die, and therefore injury and death of nerve cells causes a permanent, irrevocable, and irreplaceable loss of function. That makes them very serious. Now, as far as the parts of a nerve cell, first of all, we're going to be learning that nerve cells show probably more variation in shape and size than any other kind of cells in the body. But let's just describe some basic characteristics of their structure. The cell body is that part of a nerve cell where the nucleus is located. That's known as the cell body or soma. We'll see a picture in just a moment. There are extensions, projections coming off this cell body that are known as neuronal processes. These are the extensions or projections off the cell body. There are two types of neuronal processes or extensions. There are the dendrites and the axons. Now, structurally, the axons have little knobs at their end. These are known as synaptic knobs or axonal knobs. The axons basically conduct the electrical signal, the action potential, towards the synaptic knobs, and when that action potential reaches the synaptic knobs, it causes the release of a neurotransmitter chemical from the synaptic knob, and that neurotransmitter chemical is then released onto either another nerve cell, another neuron, or some other cell, such as a muscle cell, activating it to do something. The dendrites do not terminate, do not have these little knobs at their end. That's the difference structurally. Functionally, the function of a dendrite is to detect stimuli. Now, a stimulus is an environmental change. So the dendrites detect various changes. The dendrites of some neurons are affected by temperature, so they are detecting changes in temperature. That's the stimulus that they are responding to. The dendrites of other neurons are responding to changes in touch, mechanical movement, so that's the stimulus or environmental change they're sensitive to. There are the dendrites of other neurons that are sensitive to light, called photoreceptors. There are the dendrites of other neurons that are affected by various chemicals. They may be sensitive to sugar levels. They may be sensitive to hydrogen ion levels. They may be affected by oxygen levels. So the dendrites of different neurons are sensitive to different types of stimuli. Let's take a look at a picture of a neuron by looking at page S22. So on page S22, we see a picture of a so-called typical neuron. Now, this area right here is called the cell body or soma area. We define that as the area where the nucleus is located. We also said that coming off this cell body area are various extensions or projections known collectively as neuronal processes. I've written that term neuronal processes right down here, neuronal processes, and we've said that there are two types of neuronal processes. There are the axons, structurally, that terminate in synaptic knobs, and there are the dendrites that do not have those knobs, whose purpose is to detect environmental changes. So looking at the picture here, this particular neuronal process we've labeled is the axon, and the reason why is when we look at its termination, at its end, it terminates in these little knobs known as synaptic knobs or axonal knobs. The function of the axon, as we've said, is to conduct this action potential, this nerve impulse, this electrical current along its length, and when that electrical current reaches the synaptic knobs, it causes the release of a particular neurotransmitter chemical. Different neurons may release a different type of neurotransmitter. Some neurons release a neurotransmitter called dopamine. Other neurons release from the synaptic knob a neurotransmitter called norepinephrine. The synaptic knobs of other neurons release the neurotransmitter serotonin. The synaptic knobs of other neurons release a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. We're not going to be asking you to remember the names of these neurotransmitters, but in a physiology class, one certainly goes into a great deal of detail on the role of these neurotransmitters. When we return back to the neuron cell body, we see that these extensions, or neuronal processes, do not have little knobs at the end. These are the dendrites. And the function of the dendrites, as we've said, is to detect various environmental changes depending upon the neuron. It may be sensitive to, as we've said, temperature. Those are called thermoreceptors. It may be sensitive to touch. Those are mechanoreceptors. It may be sensitive to chemicals. Now, you'll notice also that on this axon of this particular neuron, it has what are known as myelinating cells wrapped around it. We're going to be telling you more about these myelinating cells. They come in two types. They're known as either Schwann cells, which is what this one is labeled, or Oligodendroglial cells. And these form these myelin coverings around these cells, and those neurons that have these myelinating cells conduct the action potential, the nerve impulse, this electrical current, at a faster speed, If they don't have these myelinating cells, the action potential travels at a slower speed or velocity. Neurons come in more different shapes than probably any other type of cell in our body. So just to the right, we see three different shaped neurons. So let's take a look first at this picture of this neuron right here. This is the cell body. It is because this is where the nucleus is. Now, this particular neuron cell body has two neuronal processes coming off it, right? I've labeled this one 1, and here's 2. Because it has just two neuronal processes coming off it, this neuron is described as being a bipolar shaped neuron. Bi means two, just as the word bicycle has two wheels. This has nothing to do with the psychiatric condition of having a bipolar disorder. Now, which one? One of them has to be a dendrite, one has to be an axon. So which one's which? Looking at this area right here, this neuronal process, it terminates in these synaptic knobs. That makes this the axon. You'll also notice that it has these myelinating cells wrapped around it. Looking at the upper part, this neuronal process, so you'll notice that at the very end, this does not have knobs at the end, so this is the dendrite. Notice also that it is myelinated, so it also has those myelinating cells. So this is a bipolar-shaped neuron. We're not really going to say anything more about these bipolar-shaped neurons in this anatomy class, but the bipolar-shaped neurons are located uniquely in the retina of the eye. The eye is considered part of the nervous system. It actually grows or develops right off the brain. So it is part of the brain, part of the nervous system. If we look at the neuron next to it, right here in the middle, so looking at this picture, so this is the cell body of the neuron, because this is where its nucleus is located. And you'll notice that if you look carefully, and I'm going to use my hand to show you, there is only one neuronal process coming off this cell body. That's why I just wrote 1. And then what this neuronal process does is it bifurcates, it splits into two branches, this branch going this way and this branch this way. So because this particular neuron has only one neuronal process coming off the cell body, It is described as a unipolar shaped neuron. Uni means one, so we're using this term to describe its shape. Sometimes these are also called pseudo-bipolar, something that looks like it's bipolar or has two neuronal processes, but in fact it's not truly bipolar, it's unipolar. But most of the time they call it a unipolar shaped neuron. This is an important shape because most sensory neurons, not all, but most sensory neurons in our body have this shape. So right up here are the dendrites that detect a stimulus, whether they are detecting touch, whether they're detecting temperature, whether they're detecting a chemical, and then that can initiate an action potential, and then this action potential travels along here, and you'll notice this part is shown to be myelinated, and this is shown to be myelinated. The action potential or nerve impulse is conducted down to the synaptic knobs, and when it does reach there, it triggers the release, again, of a neurotransmitter chemical from those synaptic knobs onto either another neuron or some other cell. In the picture of the third neuron here on the right, here is the cell body area, because this is where the nucleus is, and we see that it has many neuronal processes coming off it. This picture, incidentally, looks very similar to the picture we initially showed you, and because it has many neuronal processes, not one, not two, but many, it is described as a multipolar shaped neuron. Multi means many. There are many neuronal processes. Looking at the picture, though, only one of these neuronal processes is an axon, because only this one terminates in these synaptic knobs. Remember, the function of the axon is to conduct the action potential to the synaptic knobs, and when that action potential reaches the synaptic knobs, it causes the release of a neurotransmitter from the synaptic knobs onto another cell. These are all dendrites, and this particular shape is extremely important because, in fact, all motor neurons have this shape, all motor neurons, no exception, and many interneurons have this shape. We will be learning shortly that interneurons is the term we use to describe the neurons located within our brain and spinal cord, that are located entirely within our brain and spinal cord, that are used for thinking. Those are called interneurons. So back on page S3. So on S3, we've spoken of the shape of a neuron. We've talked about its cell body, the neuronal processes, of which we can divide into dendrites and axons. We've spoken of how axons terminate in these synaptic knobs from which a neurotransmitter chemical is released. And the location, incidentally, where that neurotransmitter is released from the synaptic knob onto another cell is known as the synapse. It has the root syn, S-Y-N, which means together. That's where the neuron basically connects together with another cell. It does not actually make contact with another cell, but it releases the neurotransmitter onto another cell. And right in that area where that happens, that's called the synapse. Now, we have mentioned that there can be these myelinating cells, these cells wrapped around the nerve fiber, and those that have these myelinating cells conduct that nerve impulse at a faster speed. There are two types of myelinating cells. They are known as oligodendroglial cells or Schwann cells. As we will explain more completely very shortly, they're known as oligodendroglial cells if they are wrapped around interneurons in the central nervous system, and they are known as Schwann cells if they are wrapped around either sensory neurons or motor neurons in the PNS, the peripheral nervous system. We will clarify that as we go on.